Hey everyone, I removed the Lucas Girling parking brake system from this 89 F600, and I did that by swapping the axles in the transmission. So this was probably the most labor intensive way to do that. There are other methods, but this is the method I use, so I'm gonna kind of go over how I did all that. So the first thing that I needed to do this was a donor vehicle. In my case, I used a 1996 International 4700. The reason I chose that vehicle was because it was free. It was an old pump truck we had that just was done being on the road. It was very rotten, so I've been sitting outside for a long time and I decided to use its axles and transmission for this truck. Now, one thing that's very important is whatever vehicle you use, whatever you get your parts from, you need to record the VIN for that. When you need parts for things like this, like these medium duty and heavy duty trucks, you usually need the VIN to find parts easily. And what I did is I made myself a card that included a lot of the important information from the truck that I used, such as the VIN, the type of the transmission, info about the brakes, things that I did. So this is gonna live with the truck. It'll be in the glove box forever. When it comes to choosing trucks for the donor vehicle, the 4700 was really not the best choice. I mean, it was okay for me since it was free, but it was a lot of work. And these axles are much bigger than the truck actually needs, which is fine. But if you're trying to just use like a rear axle or something, this axle has a much larger U-joint, but it worked for me just fine because I took the transmission too and I had to get the drive shaft shortened. So the bigger U-joints were fine. One benefit with using both axles is I was able to get rid of the Dayton style wheels from the Lucas Girling system, and now I have Bud style, and I also have radial tires. The F600 before had 9x20 tires with tubes and the locking ring. These are 11R 22.5 radials, so that's kind of nice. The rear was probably the easiest part because it was basically a direct bolt-in. These are the original springs to the F600. I had to get new U-bolts because it's pretty typical to cut all the U-bolts when you disassemble this stuff, and U-bolts really shouldn't be reused anyway. And I did have to rebuild all the brakes on this. These brakes are all from the 4700. The U-joints are much larger, and I just had to cut the ends off and then took it to a drive shaft shop, and I had them shorten a tube for the center and then weld it and balance it. The front axle was actually a lot of work. So on the Ford F600, the springs are located directly under the frame. On the 4700, the springs are located outboard of the frame, which meant I had to re-drill this axle, which is very difficult to do. It involved a lot of measurements and strings and a mag drill. So if you don't have like at least a mag drill, I mean, everyone's got a string, you probably shouldn't use this method. But one way that could be avoided would be to take the springs off the 4700 too and just mount them outboard on the frame. But in my case, I wanted to retain all the original springs from the F600 for ride quality because the 4700 was such a heavier truck. I'd rather not have those very stiff springs underneath the truck that's never going to weigh what that truck is rated for. Connecting the steering was another challenge. This link is off the 4700 and I connected it to the pitman arm off the F600. This is the original one for the F600. So the F600 originally in the neutral position where the tires are straight, this was going forward like that, and it was also turned around. The F600, the drag link, the ball joint went that direction and the nut was on the other side, so I had to swap this around. Being that the front axle was a much heavier weight class, all this stuff was bigger. So this is, I think I mentioned that already, if not, this is the original steering link from the International, and that's the original pitman arm from the Ford, and this ball joint was much larger. So what I had to do was I had to measure the size requirements, and then I used my drill press for the bigger side I drilled halfway, and then the smaller side I just drilled straight through. And then I used a carbide burr to get it pretty close to where it needed to be. So that's why these have new nuts, because I had I had this all separated because I had to keep test fitting. And then once I got it about where it needed to be, I used one of these tapered reamers. So I found out pretty quickly. Originally, I tried to just use this to do the whole job, and that's why I broke that. These really are not for making new holes. These are for fixing up holes. So I had to do just a lot of grinding to get it where it almost was right. And then this just finished it. And this is a 7-degree tapered reamer. So that was, this process took me probably 2 solid hours of work to get that hole right. In order to make the steering actually work, I had to center the steering box where it was in a neutral position. And one of the first steps was to get the tires in the straight forward position. And that's what this dot here is for. This is almost the exact center of the tire. And I did a lot of moving the wheels back and forth until I had a measurement from here to the frame that was the same length as the other side. And that told me that the wheels were straight forward. Now, to center the steering box, that was quite a bit of work too. I had to remove the pitman arm, and then what I would do was, after you remove that, there's no tension. I could turn that shaft all the way to the left, and then I used a level, and I made one mark. This would have been 90 degrees straight up. And then I turned the shaft the exact opposite way until it stopped, and then I made this other mark. This was 90 degrees straight up. And then I measured the distance from here to there, divided in half, and found the center, which was there. And then I took that level again against the center, and I made sure it was straight up and down. And that was my center position. And then I got the pitman arm hammered onto there. I had to use a chisel between here to spread it out enough to be able to get it on there. But that's how I did that. After I did that, the steering wheel was not straight at all. But they don't make these like in a small car where the steering wheel can only go in one position. To straighten the steering wheel, you can simply pull it off and put it where you need it, and it'll go on just fine. As for the transmission, this is a Spicer ES53. I think the most important thing that they both had the SAE2 bell housing. Now, I didn't know that this was going to work out until I actually tried it. A few people told me it wouldn't work, and well, I took the old transmission out, which was an Eaton, and I put this one in, and it went right on. Another thing about the transmission would be the flywheel. The flywheel is the original 6.6 liter flywheel. I didn't have to change that. I did take it off and get it resurfaced, but I had done some measuring, and it sat at the same distance as the flywheel did in the truck that the Spicer was in. So that worked. I did have to spend some time finding the right pilot bearing. I had to get one that fit the size of the input shaft versus the size of the hole in the flywheel. That wasn't a big deal, but that is something that you got to think about. So another issue that could be an issue is the clutch linkage. So the Eaton had a pull style clutch, whereas the Spicer has a push style. So I was a little bit worried about that. So on the Eaton, the shaft for the clutch went through the top. This one goes to the bottom. And when I put this in, the linkage, it was basically in the right spot. I did have to heat up the lever on this Spicer trans and bend it straight. And after I did that, the linkage hooked up just fine. I didn't have to really modify anything under here. One thing that I did have to modify, and it wasn't really significant, was the adjustment for the clutch here in the cab to adjust the free play. I did have to cut or take this all the way apart and trim down the threads to make them closer together. But that was not a big deal to do that. And one of the most important things when doing all this work is to have a parking brake. So the Spicer had a driveline mounted brake on it. And what I did was used a universal parking brake kit. They're basically all the same. They're available from many different manufacturers, but they're all the same. I think this one was like a 96-inch cable, and it came with the hardware like that, and I made it all work. The parking brake assembly is a pretty standard Ford parking brake. This one came out of an 85 F250. And once I removed the Lucas Girling stuff from under the hood, the two holes in the firewall that it was mounted to, the bracket, they were in the right spot for the sparking brake assembly. And I just found a bolt to fit this hole. There was already a welded nut in there. I think that this is all just the way the firewall is and the way the dash is just basic Ford stuff. So this worked fine, and then I ran that universal parking brake kit in reverse. I sent the end that would normally be at the other side in through here, so it's got the it's hard to see, but in there is that lead nut on the end of the cable, and it fit right inside the lever for this, and then it had a nut to sandwich it on the bottom to hold the sheath in place. If that makes sense, I think it does. And then for the lights, this wire here originally ran all the way to the back. There was a switch back there on a distribution block for the hydraulic parking brake system. I just pulled the wire all the way to the front, and then I just plugged it into the switch on the parking brake assembly. And when you push the parking brake, the light comes on the dash. All right, we're in here with the key on. This brake light means that the braking system isn't working because the truck's not running. I'm pretty sure that motor on the Hydro Boost is supposed to be running, so that's something we're gonna have to look into. But here, let's push the parking brake. There's my parking brake light. Let's go see it in action under the truck. Now with the Lucas Girling system, there was a manifold here, and there was another sensor that this was plugged into. And if I ground this, it'll do the same thing with the dash light. So I'm just letting it hang there, and it's not affecting anything. So under the hood, there would have been for the Lucas Girling brake system, there would have been a second power steering pump and a second reservoir. That pump would have been right here. I already removed it, and the reservoir was up here. So one thing I did have to do was find a smaller belt. This took a little bit of experimenting to find the exact right size, because this belt used to run around here around the power steering pump, and it also turns the water pump, so had to have it. As for plumbing, I'm down to just one power steering pump, which is fine, and that'd be the gear driven one off the engine. It flows out this hose into the steering box, and then I had to add this 90-degree fitting, a threaded in fitting. I had to unthread a barbed fitting because this was just a return based on the old system, and then this hose here came off the International 4700, because these are, it seems like all these big trucks all use this same Hydro Boost. So I took the old fitting out of here. I added this International 4700 power steering fitting, which runs down here. I did have to get it shortened at a hydraulic shop. They took, I think it was about a foot off of here. I just didn't have to do that, but I'd rather not have an extra foot of hose. And then the return after the Hydro Boost comes out of here and runs into the bottom of the reservoir. Well, that's pretty much how I did it. I mean, it was a major undertaking. It took me quite a lot of time to do it, and there are easier ways, but for me this way was the cheapest, you know, other than the price of, I did buy a new clutch for it. I probably didn't need to, but I didn't want to reuse that old clutch. And then the price to get the drive shaft cut down, I think that was like $75. And the parking brake kit, I think that was only like $50 on Amazon. And everything else I just had from other trucks that I took things off. I will need to get new tires before I actually use this, but you know, that's really irrelevant to the actual cost of removing a Lucas Girling braking system. And that's it. I've got a tank body outside to put on this thing, and once I get these other trucks out of my way, then I can put that on there, and then this truck will not be ready for the road because it'll still need painted, but it'll be one step closer. So thanks for watching.